Hello and welcome to all the Hillians of the West. I'm Joe. Here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
And today we're going to be discussing the timeline of The Legend of Zelda. This is a cluster, as AVGN once put it, because this is just such a mess of a timeline. And yet, I'm gonna be honest, I really love it. I'm sorry, I have to confess, I have Stockholm towards this thing.
Who doesn't?
There's something just beautiful and daring about it. In the context that there is no other fantasy universe that has had the cojones to have 3 different timelines. And yeah, they're retelling oftentimes the same story, but the lore is different. The maps are slightly different. This is one thing that I think Zelda has over any other fantasy universe. And I kind of think that maybe Warcraft should have gone with this route. Maybe a Horde victory timeline, a Alliance victory timeline, what we currently have in WoW, where you'd have 3 different timelines you get to choose to play in World of Warcraft. That'd be pretty cool.
Indeed.
But for Zelda, here we go. At the beginning, there was creation. Yeah, we already did that with our Theogony video. Check it out. Skyward Sword is the first game in the entire saga. And this game's not one I'm terribly familiar with, I'm not gonna lie. It's a really weird story, and it's basically the Adam and Eve thing, except with Link and Zelda. And yes, I'm cracking a joke about AVGN again. I really like his channel. After Skyward Sword, we have the Banishment of the Twilight, are the ancestors of Midna. We have the Sacred Realm, which is sealed, and the Kingdom of Hyrule, which is founded. We then get the Minish Cap. I honestly am not familiar with this game. I didn't know about this game till about 2 years ago, if I'm being honest.
I heard of it in passing.
Okay, so you were more knowledgeable than I.
Because I was aware that there were 1 or 2 other games surrounding Four Swords.
Yeah, I knew that. I just didn't know Minish Cap. But the interesting thing is, for Four Swords, that one I knew. Remember, we played it as kids. It was pretty fun. Four Swords is a great story, if a bit of a weird one in some ways. Just in that you have Link who splits into 4. That's such a weird concept. And yet, I'd like to see them explore it more. And whatever happened to the Four Sword? Because, I'm not sure what happened to that sword that splits them into 4. It's not the Master Sword. I'd be interested in maybe seeing it make a resurgence in a Breath of the Wild type game.
Hopefully they come with something on the new Switch console.
Next is the Hyrulean Civil War. Yeah, okay. This is in the backstory of Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time, we all know, we all have probably pretty fond memories of. While it's not my favorite game of the franchise, and I never fully made it to the end because I made it to just before the boss of the game. That being said, I have seen our brother beat the game time and time again. Ocarina of Time takes place during the War of Sealing, as I think it's also been called. That takes place in the backstory to A Link to the Past. So really, it's a prequel to a prequel of the original game from the 80s. But it's in Ocarina of Time when the timeline splits into the hero's defeated timeline, sees the imprisoning war. You then get the hero's triumphant timeline, where this one itself splits into the child timeline and the adult timeline. You've got 2 other timelines. They both have their own tendencies. We'll start with the adult timeline, where Link was successful and beat Ganon. There was much rejoicing.
Yay!
Next game in the timeline here is Wind Waker. Hyrule was sealed and then flooded because Ganon broke free and there was no hero of time, it seems, to defeat him. Now, if the hero went back in time and his soul is basically in the other timeline, in timeline C, and in the timeline where the hero is defeated, of course he could be reincarnated, but where are they getting Link's soul in this timeline is my question. Not to mention, why did Hyrule need flooding? Yeah, Ganon came out, but apparently he was too hot to handle. Why didn't they just bring in Link if they did have access to him? I'll get to a small solution idea I have for this, which some may not like me, and I may not like me after I propose it. So, okay. We have the Wind Waker game, then the Phantom Hourglass, and then Spirit Tracks. To an extent, I would hypothesize that maybe Breath of the Wild is in this timeline, 10,000 years later. I kind of got the feeling Breath of the Wild, with the Great Calamity and whatnot, is maybe its own timeline, to an extent. But quite how that could work with the 3 different timelines, I'm not entirely sure. But as to my little theory, or my possible solution, so Ganon breaks free, and Hyrule is flooded. This is where I would maybe the cartoon goes here, and where that Link failed in the end. And so Ganon needed to be sealed, and Hyrule was flooded. The cartoon is thus proposed as a prequel to Wind Waker. Given the cartoony graphics of Wind Waker, and that, well, cartoon was cartoon, what do you think of this theory, Dan?
Plausible because of the constant attempt to take the Triforce.
But it also doesn't make much sense because Ganon probably didn't go for the ceiling in there, and the cartoon's just not accurate at all. But on
Yeah.
the other hand, I like the idea of putting the cartoon into the timeline just for fun, just to torture people.
Yeah.
That said, Ganon in there was not sealed up, but he did break free, so what if this Link lost? He obviously doesn't have the Master Sword. He was a bit cocky, so maybe he failed. I'm gonna be honest, I actually liked that depiction of Link. I thought he was fun.
I agree.
I liked his character, but for him to lose would add depth and tragedy to the story of the cartoon. There's an ultimate triumph in that the Wind Waker story concludes the cartoon. I think that this would also add an extra element to the Wind Waker, so that the epilogue of the cartoon is that Hyrule is flooded. And then long afterwards, you get the Wind Waker story, where Ganon is revived and defeated by Link, and the Triforce is united and whatnot, and Hyrule is washed away with its people setting out for a new land. This timeline is not my favorite, but it's got potential, I think, for a lot of interesting stories. And I do hope Breath of the Wild is in this timeline, so they build on it, because it doesn't seem to have as much content as the other two timelines. I don't say that to disregard this timeline, I just want more stuff in it, because it has 3 games, and let's be honest, the 3 games, so I would want them to put in Breath of the Wild into this timeline. Next, we get the child timeline, where Ganon's plot is stopped. Okay, here we go. We have Majora's Mask, of course.
It shouldn't surprise anyone.
Yeah, after Majora's Mask, it's a few centuries later that we get Twilight Princess, where in this timeline, Ganon was sealed and banished to the Twilight Realm. And the Twilight invade the Kingdom of Hyrule, with Ganon returning, but is defeated by Link and slain. But because of Four Swords Adventure, he is reincarnated as Demon King Ganon, and the Demon Vati also returns, but is defeated. And Link seals away Ganon using the Four Sword. Ganon doesn't catch much of a break in this timeline.
His plans are always thwarted.
This is the timeline with the most horror stuff. I've noticed Majora, Twilight Princess, they have much more of a horror feel. And it's interesting because weirdly the adult timeline seems to be the most child-friendly. As for child timeline, it's funny because while it's the most adult, I kind of think that, not to try to stick Nintendo into pigeonholes, but maybe any dark fantasy, horror style Zelda games and stories should be shoved into this timelines, as it makes the most sense. Where adult timeline is all about exploration, with child timeline being more of a semi-horror dark fantasy thing, which honestly, that's really my cup of tea. I love that stuff. We then get to the other timeline. I would argue the OG timeline to an extent, considering the 2 80s games were the original Zelda games. A Link to the Past is the game I'm most familiar with because it's the one I grew up watching my oldest brother play. Well, it and Ocarina of Time, of course. Not gonna lie, I have not beaten very many Zelda games. Do, however, have a soft spot for them. Well, I'm making videos about this content, so obviously I do like it and it did leave an impression on me. A Link to the Past is my favorite of the franchise, alongside Hyrule Warriors. And I know a great many don't regard Hyrule Warriors as being worthy, but I really have a soft spot for that game.
Probably the game I've played the most as well. I'm
Yeah.
much more into the hack and slash.
A Link to the Past feels more like epic high fantasy. It's not exactly a Lord of the Rings style game, but it's a game which has a similar feel to Predain, or to an extent even Hour of the Dragon from Conan. Basically, the kingdom is plunged to its lowest point and Link has to rise up to the occasion and do the hero's journey and stop the Demon King Ganon. Followed by the Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. And then you have A Link Between Worlds. I have not played, but I know it's popular. You have Triforce Heroes. No, wait, Triforce Heroes is the... You have here an epic fantasy story, almost more in line with Fire Emblem than anything else. And you have, of course, The Legend of Zelda and The Adventure of Link. What I would like to see come after this is maybe a conclusion to this Link's story, because it was left hanging. I'm gonna come up with a possible fan theory explanation. The Link we see in Hyrule Warriors is this Link. Maybe he made it back to the castle, awakened Zelda, and then all the various timeline convergence nonsense takes place. The trouble is with Tia playing with the timeline, would that create more sub-timelines? But what if it's at the start with the heroes defeated and the heroes triumphant thing? Would it create a fourth set of, or a fifth set of timelines? The thing about the timeline split is that it opens up a lot of can of worms and a lot of different possibilities. That being said, one thing I do love that Nintendo has done with this is that they have given us different subgenres of fantasy. You have the more exploration-based type of stories, and kind of, it's like the Age of Exploration. The child timeline, where it's a horror set of stories. And this has a lot of potential. Then you have the epic high fantasy Link to the Past timeline. What I would like to see is maybe Nintendo make a fourth timeline. In this timeline, maybe we could have mystery fantasy stories. That'd be fun. Why not crack mysteries as Link? Showcase him as a pretty brainy guy. Zelda Fire Emblem timeline for another one. That'd be neat.
A good tactics game wouldn't hurt.
I'm not talking about replacing the old formula. Actually, I'm going to make a weird argument. I am actually a little irritated that they've occasionally done this, but what I want to see them do is expand on, say, the adult timeline, but at the same time that they release that, maybe a 2D horror game of Zelda in the child timeline, where for every major release they make in one timeline, they release a smaller game the other two timelines. When they go to move to the next timeline, because I noticed they made Wind Waker, but then they ended up making Twilight Princess. Okay, so what if they, when making the next kind of Twilight Princess game, release a smaller game for the adult and Heroes Defeated timelines? And then maybe for the Heroes Defeated timeline, they make a major game there, and then they make two minor games in the other two timelines. This way they're continuously expanding all three, and maybe some of these smaller games can be used as filler between two larger releases. I kind of think the Heroes Defeated is probably in the most need for a new game in terms of major releases, because it doesn't seem to have had any 3D releases, ever. It's almost purely 2D games. Why not release a new game in that timeline? Now, I know I sound like I'm whining, but actually, there's so much possibilities to this timeline business. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Link taking down Ganon.